Welcome back, radio entrepreneurs, listeners, and fans. I'm producer Lauren Davis, and I'm excited to introduce you all to the 7th FBA Family Business Panel discussion, The Next Generation of Family Business as Entrepreneur. In this family business-related fall 2022 edition of the panel, we will be covering topics related to plans of succession and potential pitfalls, fostering entrepreneurship, when family issues affect the business, and much, much more. This episode is part 1 of 3, and all of these discussions are intended to be highly relevant to family businesses, but also to entrepreneurs of all types. So be sure to follow Radio Entrepreneurs on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, or any of the many other platforms we stream on to catch each of the other segments as they go live. Before we get into the discussion, allow me to introduce our panelists. Today, we have 3 returning panelists that you should know well: Stephen Wilchins, founding partner at Wilchins, Cosentino, and Novins; Kelly Berardi, partner at Gray, Gray & Gray; and Rich Hirschens, partner also at Gray, Gray & Gray. Welcome all, glad you can be with us today. Next, I'm excited to introduce a special guest to our panel, Chris Sanders, Business Performance Advisor for Insperity. Up until recently, Chris was the Director of Sales and Marketing at San-tron, his family's very successful third-generation business. Finally, I would like to introduce the panel's moderator, Radio Entrepreneurs host, and CEO of Mage LLC, Jeffrey Davis. Welcome, Jeffrey. I will now hand the conversation over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Great job. Great introduction. It's all downhill from you. Well, everybody, this is a great time to be talking about family businesses and the economy and the next generation. And I just want to start with a general question, and that is, do you think this economy has helped to create more family instability and instability within the business during these times? Does anybody want to take that first?
I'll take it first. So definitely yes. I mean, the older generation is faced with either giving up the reins. At the same time, there's so much insecurity in the relationships of people, the marketplace, and the economy. And so it's created a lot of challenges, both for the family itself and the business. So most definitely.
And I would agree with that. I would say that the baby boomers, if they're still around, are trying to figure out what their future is, and the millennials, if that's what we're going to talk about, the millennials who are in the family businesses are trying to push, and they want the transition, but they're not sure also about the business. And there's a lot of instability with what's been going on. I know, Rich, you've seen some of this with supply chain.
Yeah, there's just so much uncertainty out there right now that it's just causing everyone to pause. We don't know what's going on in the world from one minute to the next, it seems. The stock markets are down, interest rates are up. I mean, the employment markets are really tight. It's just a very hard time to do business right now. And, I think certainly for the older generation, they might be looking at protecting their assets. Maybe the younger generation wants to be investing in the future. So you have that, those two aspects. So I think it's a challenging time that we're all living with. So step up to the challenge.
Chris.
The political landscape has really made it a tough situation. Just the dissension between the parties and just how people act as politicians is just terrible, and it's just created a tough situation for businesses as well.
I think I'm glad you brought up that point, Stephen, because, and Chris, maybe, you can talk from the experience of having a family business, but from what I've seen in the last 2 years, since the beginning of COVID, I like to use that as my timetable, my calendar. I'm on the PC calendar post-COVID. And I have seen more stress and more arguing and tension within families than I saw the previous 30 years. And it seems, it's so hard to get through the tension to get to discuss true business issues without the emotions. So I agree with you, Steve.
Mhm.
Now,
And I
Chris,
think
you were
even-
in a family business, third
Yeah.
generation. And for a long time, I think your business was on autopilot. And now you're doing what we do. You're an advisor to businesses.
Correct. And going back to Rich's point about seeing some of that older generation kind of really worrying about their own and trying to hold on, it's almost if they're squeezing too tight, right? And it's not allowing that, the younger generation to kind of look and plan and be able to invest in the future, right? Worrying about this, maybe squeezing just a bit too tight there.
Good. So I'll go to the next question if no one minds. Since entrepreneurship is really the key to survival, how do you really teach or get leaders to understand entrepreneurship in today's world? How do you have that dialogue and how do you prepare them for the next generation? Does anybody have an idea on that?
I think you need to just be supportive of ideas. The younger generation may have ideas that are very different than the older generation. Maybe it's with technology or apps, or they might be more in touch with the people their age and what they're looking for. And I think sometimes it's just having an open mind to that and being supportive of the next generation when they come up with ideas and not shutting them down because maybe that doesn't work for you, or that's not what your generation, how they use things or do things. So I think having an open mind is really important.
I think an open mind is good, but it depends on where in the business cycle the business is and how it's impacted currently will depend on how one should react. But, certainly encouraging ideas is good, but sometimes, survival is important and sometimes financial issues are important that overtake some of the ideas that the younger generation wants to implement. And so there's a real balance. And so one has to understand that it can't be done in a vacuum. It has to be looked at specifically for each company.
I think you have to get the younger generation involved in entrepreneurial thought and opportunities. And so if there are things that are happening at the higher levels, I think it's important to engage the, younger generations, even just in that whole thought process, even if they don't have input, just to sort of allow them to see how ideas transpire, how they unfold, and how you get through the whole process. I think that's important to get people exposed early and often.
And Kelly, I was just thinking, I tend to think as all of you were talking, I've always found it easier to talk about transition when I have it as a business discussion. And I would assume that using tax and tax estate planning, and the same question to you, Steve, as the basis for transition conversation can make it a little easier, because when it's an emotional discussion, you never get anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that a lot. I agree. I think that's a great way to sort of introduce succession planning and transition planning. And you can have discussions around, the time being right because of discounts and because of tax law changes and things like that. So it definitely opens the door to discussions, and it takes sort of the personal, takes the personal side out of it. And not to mention the tax stuff. Can be very complicated depending on the structure of the business. And it's really important to get the younger generation involved in understanding that stuff, because it takes a while for people to learn it and how it impacts their individual taxes. And I've seen a lot of times where the younger generation takes over and they were never sort of primed in, the tax piece of the business, and just getting even the entity tax returns done was a headache because they didn't understand how everything flowed. So it's just a good idea to get them involved early, especially dealing with all that tax and legal stuff.
Stephen, do you want to add to that as well?
I think Kelly alluded to the income tax side, but on the estate tax side in particular, where the exemption is so large, and even this year where the exemption increases another 900 to $1 million per taxpayer, I think it's going to make it easier for clients to start thinking about gifting, either in outright gifting or into, some type of trust, some type of family trust to deal with the estate tax issues.
This is a subject maybe I'll end up debating with some of the panel. Do you think it's a good idea to have a clear, transparent transition plan from the beginning or not? And I've seen mixed opinions about that. And I know, Chris, you'll have opinions about that after all of us speak. Does anybody want to take that one on?
What do you define as the beginning? Like day one of employment or when they're born?
I've seen both.
Yeah.
I'm currently working with a company where I think almost from third or fourth grade, there was a child wrote a story at school about how they were going to run their family business, and that's been the plan since then.
Yeah.
And not getting in the way. But I think, right now, let's say in this economy, is it good to sort of put a plan together to look at the business? Because, it's, if you're not looking at how the company is going to maintain entrepreneurship and leadership, doesn't it really create a lot of instability?
I think it's a good idea to have a plan. What that plan may be different, depending on the circumstances and all that, but to have a plan, one, to find out if the next generation is really interested in owning the company and running the company. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of stress. It's not the easiest, not for everyone. And so, I think that's the first question. If the next generation has no interest in it, well, then that changes the conversation. So I think it's a good idea to have those conversations early. It may be a 10-year plan, it may be longer, it may be shorter, but put it out on the table and gauge everyone's interest.
I think the plan is good, but it depends on how much one discloses and how much you engage in the next generation in that plan would also be important, and how much they understand at the level they're at. So I think all that is important. Generally, a plan is good. You have to be careful how it's laid out and how it's implemented and executed.
I think the plan also has to be flexible. Given how quickly things change in the world and in the family, I think it's got to be, flexible, and it can't be a rigid plan. I think it's good to have a guideline, but not, stick to it in every case.
Chris, you want to touch that one?
Yeah, and I think everybody really touched on it in the same way that I look at it. You definitely need a plan. There needs to be clear and concise sort of messaging. You can also be, that previous generation from the leadership standpoint, the mentorship, to help them prepare for moving forward in the next generation. There's a lot. And it doesn't come quickly. It takes time, right? So you're constantly growing and helping that next generation as they prepare. And then, as Kelly said, that flexibility, because things change. They're always changing, right? As we are, it's 2022. It's a lot different than it was even in 2019, right? As we know, as we've all kind of lived through what we have here over the past few years. So,
where it gets challenging, though, is if the older generation who's running the company truly doesn't feel comfortable that the next generation can handle the business. And so, you may have a plan, but how do you roll it out? How do you get those second generation or third generation family members involved, even though that they may not have the ability to be the CEO? That's a challenge.
And I agree with that, Stephen. And I'd add, what about baby boomers who hold on too long? We've seen both sides of that.
Yeah.
And say, I can't leave because I don't know what I'll do with my life. And they're not necessarily understanding the business and the marketplace. And Chris, you've seen that as well. I like to say as a consultant that we follow the scientific the scientific methodology, and we use the social scientific methodology. And that is, we create a plan, but because it's human data, you always have to be prepared to change as the data is coming in and adapt as you go. So have your goal in mind, but look at the data as it's coming in and adapt it as you go. And I think Chris has seen that a lot in his family. He watched a couple of transitions of his family business. And then Chris was part of that transition to some degree. And you just don't know how people are going to react at different times. My last question in this segment really has to do with something I think we've all seen, and that is, should you mandate that family members should get some type of training outside of the family business? And how can that be handled better?
I'll go then. I'm a strong proponent of people working outside the business. Reality sets in pretty quickly, and your ties to your family really don't matter in the next business, in the outside business. And I think it's great because you have the opportunity to work in an environment with peers in a totally separate environment, and you're judged based on your skills, not based on your tradition or family history. And I think it's a wonderful experience for family members to get that opportunity to explore before they come back into the business.
I agree with you, Steve. I think it's great. You know, they go to a company that's not owned by their family and they're an employee just like anyone else. And I think that's good to understand that perspective. I think that will help them in running their family's company, but also they get to see other businesses and how they run. So, you know, oftentimes they've been brought up in the family business. It's all they know. And you can learn things from other businesses. So I think those are great lessons. I think when it can be done, I think it's a really good idea.
Right. Plus, I guess entitlement isn't a word that you understand when you go into someone else's business.
Right. Right. Then you have that appreciation for when you're working in your family's business, and
Exactly.
maybe keep that entitlement privilege to a minimum.
Yeah, and I just think it gives you a great deal of perspective. And if you happen to come from a very large organization and your family business is a small organization, you're able to bring sort of best practices and ideas from somewhere outside of your family business, which is huge. And it could be that you've got a family business that's full of people that have never worked anywhere else. And so you may be the only person coming from, you know, sort of the outside world, which is, you know, hugely beneficial to everybody within the organization.
Chris, you've had that experience of what I would call family rules in a business versus corporate rules.
Yeah, for sure. And we certainly had some of us that, you know, didn't get that outside experience, and some of us that did. And you know, I agree with the entire panel here. It makes a huge difference for a family member to go outside, work out in the real world, so to speak, and not in this kind of this little bubble where you're protected and you're treated because of your last name, because of where you came from, and you can certainly bring a lot back to the business, right? So yeah, I agree.
You know, we're going to get our producer back now, and I just want to say that what I have found, almost like a line in the sand, is that when I hear people talking to me about family rules, almost all the time they've never worked in a corporate environment. And whenever I hear someone talking about good corporate rules, corporate governance, and corporate standards, operating agreements, I know that they've actually had real professional standards. So I agree with Kelly, the entitlement doesn't work. And in today's world, if you want to protect that cash cow, you got to bring, you got to meld together the family, what's good about the family with good corporate standards. This is the end of our first segment, so I'll turn it over to our producer, Lauren Davis.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was a very interesting conversation on planned succession and potential pitfalls. That wraps up part 1 of this fall 2022 edition of the FBA Family Business Panel Discussion. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers who have tuned in for this first segment on Radio Entrepreneurs. Links will be provided in the video's description below to parts 2 and 3 of the discussion to hear more on these topics. So be sure to check out those links, click subscribe just below the video if you're on YouTube, or follow if you're listening on one of our podcast platforms to stay up to date on all our postings as they go live. If you're a fan of our videos, please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Press the bell button. It helps immensely. Radio Entrepreneurs is also active on LinkedIn, so be sure to go there and follow our page for more business advice and discussions. Until next time, goodbye, and thank you for listening. We'll be back with more stories on Radio Entrepreneurs.